They don't leave because you are not enough. They leave when they feel they are losing themselves inside love. And the strange truth is, what makes them stay is not more love, but a different kind of presence that their nervous system finally understands as safe. Have you ever felt like the more you cared, the more they pulled away? And the moment you stopped chasing, something in them changed?
If yes, you are already inside a deeper psychological pattern than you realize. They never text you first. They don't say, "I love you" back on time, sometimes not even when you are waiting for it. They disappear for a few days and then return like nothing ever changed, as if silence never happened. And slowly you start questioning everything. You think maybe they are just cold. Maybe they do not feel much. Maybe they are different from you. But the truth is not that simple. They are not cold in the way you think. You fell for someone who quietly made you believe that if you were calm enough, patient enough, soft enough, and easy enough to hold, then one day they would finally stay without leaving again.
But here is what you don't see at first. They did not really leave in the way you feel it. They were never fully present in the first place. Even when they were laughing with you, talking with you, or sitting close to you, a part of them was still standing at a distance inside themselves. It was not complete presence. It was partial connection. And that is why their change feels so confusing, because you are responding to closeness while they are quietly managing distance at the same time without fully explaining it to you. Here is something most people never understand. They are not avoiding you as a person. They are avoiding a feeling. A deep internal feeling that says love might mean losing themselves. It feels like if they go too deep into connection, they will lose control, lose independence, or lose safety. So they protect themselves before anything can feel too real. And when you understand this, something inside you starts to shift. You stop chasing in the same desperate way. You stop shrinking your needs just to fit their comfort. You stop performing a version of yourself just to keep them close. And something unexpected happens in that shift. You become the one person they find harder to walk away from, not because you are controlling them, but because you are no longer feeding the cycle of fear and chase. You are no longer reacting the same way. And in that calm space, they feel something different around you. Not pressure, not demand, but stability. And for someone who is used to emotional chaos inside relationships, that stability feels unfamiliar, almost like something they cannot easily detach from anymore. Understanding avoidant behavior is not about manipulation or tricks. It is not about playing emotional games or pretending to be someone else. It is about seeing deeper into human psychology.
It is about recognizing that what looks like distance is often protection, not indifference.
And when you stop taking everything personally, you stop breaking yourself trying to fix something that was never fully in your control. You start responding with awareness instead of emotional panic, and that changes everything about how the relationship feels from your side. Stay with me here, because this understanding can change how you see almost every connection you have ever experienced. There are people who have been deeply hurt by this cycle of closeness and distance without even realizing what was happening. If you have ever felt this pattern in your life, you might relate more than you think. If you have ever loved someone who pulled away the moment things started to feel real, you already know the emotional confusion that comes with it. Let me ask you something simple. Have you ever been in a relationship where you felt like you were always a little too much?
A little too emotional, a little too expressive, a little too present, a little too open with how you feel. And the more you tried to be close, the more the other person seemed to move away, not in anger, but in quiet distance. It can feel like you are trying to reach someone who is always just one step further than where you are standing. You might remember moments that felt beautiful and real, a shared laugh, A soft conversation, a warm connection that made you think things were finally stable. And then suddenly, the next day, the energy changes.
They are still there, but not really there. Less responsive, less open, more silent. And your mind starts working non-stop. You begin replaying everything, trying to find the mistake. What did I do? What changed? Was I too much? Was I not enough? That confusion slowly becomes emotional exhaustion. That cycle is not you being unstable or overly sensitive. It is what happens when one person is emotionally leaning in and the other is emotionally stepping back. It creates an imbalance that feels personal, but often is not. And in that space, you start to question your own value. You begin to adjust yourself, trying to become easier, lighter, quieter, hoping it will stop the distance. But the more you adjust, the more you lose yourself inside the connection. And then, something important needs to be understood. This is where avoidant patterns show themselves most clearly. Because when you reach more, they often withdraw more. Not because they enjoy it, but because their system reads closeness as pressure. And so both people end up stuck in a loop. One reaches, one retreats. One asks for closeness, the other creates space. And neither person feels truly safe in the process, even if there is real care underneath it all. When you finally start to see this pattern clearly, something inside you begins to slow down. You stop reacting immediately. You stop assuming every distance is rejection. You stop tying your worth to someone else's ability to stay emotionally consistent. And in that awareness, you begin to respond differently. You are still human, still feeling, but no longer completely controlled by panic when distance appears. And as you read this, notice something. The story is still continuing, because this is not just about understanding someone else. It is also about understanding why you reacted the way you did, why the chase felt so automatic, and why silence from them felt so loud inside your mind. You try harder. You become more available, more understanding, more flexible, more forgiving, more patient than you normally are. You tell yourself that if you just adjust a little more, if you just soften yourself a bit more, if you just make things easier for them, then maybe they will finally feel safe enough to stay. But what actually happens inside the avoidance system is something very different from what you expect. The more you move toward them with urgency, the more their nervous system interprets it as pressure.
The closeness that you are offering starts to feel heavier for them, not lighter. It feels like emotional demand instead of emotional connection. And when that feeling builds up inside them, the alarm does not stay quiet. It becomes louder. Because now they are not only dealing with closeness, they are also dealing with intensity.
They start to feel overwhelmed, not because you are doing something wrong, but because their system was never trained to hold emotional closeness for long periods without discomfort. And this is where they begin to pull away even more. Not as punishment, not as rejection, but as a way to regulate themselves. They create distance to breathe again, to feel in control again, to return to the emotional state that feels familiar and safe to them. This is what creates what people often call the anxious avoidant loop. One person moves closer out of fear of loss, and the other moves away out of fear of being consumed. And when both of these reactions keep repeating, it becomes a cycle that drains both sides emotionally. It is not just confusion, it is nervous system response meeting nervous system response, without understanding in between.
And if you stay inside this loop without awareness, it slowly starts to affect your self-worth, your emotional stability, and your ability to see the situation clearly. Now it is important to shift perspective here, because most of the time the conversation stays focused on what avoidants do. Their distance, their silence, their hot and cold behavior, their disappearing and returning patterns.
But very rarely do people stop and ask what is actually going on inside them, underneath all of this behavior. And even less often do people ask, what they actually want beneath all of this protection. Because underneath the distance, there is still a human desire for connection that is not gone, just guarded. If you think deeply about it, the avoidant does want love. Not love that feels like pressure. Not love that feels like emotional weight sitting on their chest. Not love that turns every small space into a discussion about the relationship. They want love that feels steady, but not suffocating, present, but not overwhelming. They want a partner who does not fall apart every time they take space. Someone who does not turn silence into panic. Someone who does not make emotional distance feel like abandonment. They want someone who can sit in their own life fully. Someone who is not emotionally dependent on daily validation.
Someone who is not tracking every delay, every unread message, every moment of distance as a sign of rejection.
They want a partner whose sense of self is not built on whether they are being constantly chosen in every moment, but on a deeper sense of internal stability. Someone who is already whole, not someone trying to become whole through the relationship. And this is where their internal fantasy begins to make sense. Deep down, the avoidant is not looking for someone who chases them harder. They are looking for someone who does not lose themselves in the process of loving them. Someone who is not emotionally collapsing when space is needed. Someone who does not make their independence feel like a threat. Because for them, love has often been linked with pressure, expectation, and emotional overwhelm, even if that was never the intention of the other person. This is why, when you become more grounded in yourself, something shifts in how they respond to you. Not because you are controlling the situation, but because you are no longer feeding the same emotional pattern.
You are not reacting in panic. You are not escalating the cycle. You are not turning every moment of distance into emotional urgency. And in that shift, they start to experience something different.
A connection that does not immediately demand something from them every time they step away for a moment. That difference is what creates curiosity again. Because now, instead of feeling chased, they feel space. Instead of feeling pressure, they feel room to breathe. And in that space, the mind starts to wonder, where did that intensity go? Why is the emotional pressure not there right now? What changed? And slowly, sometimes without even realizing it, their attention begins to return. But it is important to understand something very clearly here. Becoming this grounded version of yourself is not about strategy or emotional control over another person. It is not about pretending you do not care when you actually do. It is not about acting distant to trigger a response. That kind of behavior is not stability, it is performance, and it eventually collapses under emotional pressure. True emotional grounding is different. It is when you stop making one relationship the center of your emotional world. It is when your identity is not collapsing every time someone pulls away. It is when you can feel love without losing your own direction. When they go quiet, you do not immediately spiral into self-doubt. You return to your life. You focus on your own thoughts, your own goals, your own emotional balance. Not as a tactic, but as a way of staying connected to yourself. And in that state, you also stop over-explaining yourself. You stop sending long emotional messages trying to fix silence. You stop repeatedly asking for reassurance in ways that slowly drain your own energy. Not because your feelings are wrong, but because you begin to understand that constant emotional chasing does not create real security. It only increases imbalance in the dynamic. Avoidant individuals are often very sensitive to emotional inconsistency that feels performative. They can sense when independence is not real, when distance is being used as a tactic, when behavior is being adjusted just to create a reaction. But what they respond to differently is genuine self-contained presence. Someone who is not trying to prove independence, but actually living it. This is where many people misunderstand the idea completely. It is not about becoming distant or emotionally unavailable yourself. It is about becoming internally steady. It is about having a life that continues even when the other person is not fully engaged. It is about not turning emotional uncertainty into personal collapse. Because when your entire emotional system is no longer dependent on their constant attention, the dynamic between you naturally changes. And when that change happens, something interesting occurs in the avoidant mind. They begin to experience something they are not used to in relationships. Space that does not feel like abandonment.
Distance that does not feel like punishment. Connection that does not immediately turn into emotional pressure.
And in that unfamiliar environment, their nervous system begins to soften slightly. Sometimes this is when they return, not because they were chased, not because they were pressured, but because they feel, even if briefly, that connection does not automatically equal loss of self. And that realization is what makes the connection feel less threatening over time. But even here, there is an important truth you cannot ignore. You cannot lose yourself in order to become someone who fits inside another person's emotional limitations. If you abandon your own needs completely, if you silence your own emotional reality just to maintain closeness, then the relationship stops being healthy for you, even if it feels stable on the surface. What actually matters is balance. Not chasing, not disappearing, not overgiving, not emotionally shutting down, but learning to stay connected to yourself while also staying open to another person.
And when you start operating from that place, your entire experience of love begins to change, regardless of who you are with.
Because at the deepest level, this is not only about understanding avoidant behavior. It is also about understanding your own emotional patterns, your own attachment responses, and the way your past experiences shape what feels familiar to you today. They begin to connect being with you to feeling drained. And once that association forms in their nervous system, it becomes very difficult for them to stay present for long. Every time things start to feel emotionally close, the body remembers that drained feeling, even if nothing is actually wrong in the moment. So instead of staying, they start preparing to leave internally. Not always physically leaving right away, but emotionally stepping back first, creating distance before it becomes overwhelming again. When you escalate as they go quiet, the pattern becomes even stronger. The avoidant pulls back, sometimes without explanation, sometimes with very little communication.
And in response, the other person naturally reacts more messages, more questions, more attempts to reconnect. Then the avoidant pulls even further away, because now the emotional intensity feels higher than before. And then the anxious side reacts even more, trying to close the gap. Within a short time, both people are no longer communicating clearly.
They are reacting to each other's nervous system states instead of actually understanding each other. This is how the anxious avoidant loop fully forms. It is not just confusion. It is a repeated emotional pattern where both sides trigger each other's deepest fears. The anxious side fears loss, so they pursue. The avoidant side fears pressure, so they withdraw. And both reactions feel completely logical to the person experiencing them. But together, they create a cycle that slowly drains emotional energy from both people until the relationship feels exhausting instead of safe. What the avoidant actually needs in those quiet moments is not pursuit. It is space. Not space as punishment, not silence as a game, but genuine emotional breathing room. When you chase during their withdrawal phase, you unintentionally confirm their internal belief that closeness equals pressure. So instead of calming them, it intensifies their need to step back.
And this is where many relationships get stuck, because both people are trying to fix the discomfort using the only strategies they know, but those strategies are working against each other.
Another important layer is how emotions are expressed. Many avoidant individuals did not grow up in environments where emotions were clearly named, supported, or processed in a healthy way. Because of that, their emotional vocabulary can feel limited. When they receive very long emotional messages filled with deep feelings, analysis, and layered pain, they do not always experience it as connection. Instead, it can feel like emotional overload, not because your feelings are wrong, but because their system struggles to process that level of intensity all at once. The result is often withdrawal, not engagement. This is why the way emotions are shared matters as much as the emotions themselves. There is a difference between saying, "I felt distant from you this week, and I miss you," and sending a long message breaking down every emotional impact, every fear, every insecurity tied to their behavior. The first message is easier for them to hear and respond to.
The second one can feel like too much information at once, which makes them shut down instead of open up. It is not about reducing your truth. It is about pacing how it is expressed so it can actually be received. At the same time, it is not only about what you should avoid doing.
It is also about what you can begin doing differently. One important shift is learning to give space before it turns into conflict. When you notice they are busy, distant, or less responsive, instead of immediately reacting, you can acknowledge it calmly. Something simple, grounded, and pressure-free creates a very different emotional experience for them. It removes the feeling of being chased and replaces it with a sense of being understood as a separate individual. This emotional fluctuation increases the avoidance need for protection. But when you become more emotionally steady, even during uncertainty, the dynamic begins to shift. Stability becomes something they can recognize instead of unpredictability they need to defend against. Having your own life is not just advice here, it is essential. Friends, interests, work, hobbies, personal goals, and emotional support systems are not distractions from love. They are what keep love from becoming dependency.
When your life is full, two things naturally happen. First, you stop placing the entire emotional weight of your happiness on one person. Second, you become more grounded and self-contained, which makes the connection feel lighter for both sides. Responding differently to hot and cold behavior is another important change.
When they return after distance, responding with punishment, coldness, or emotional withdrawal often reinforces their belief that relationships are unstable. Instead, responding with calmness and steadiness creates a different emotional message. It shows that connection does not automatically turn into conflict or emotional retaliation. That safety is what many avoidant individuals have never consistently experienced before. But all of this requires something deeper first. It requires letting go of the version of the relationship you wished for. The version where they always reached out first, where communication was effortless, where emotional closeness never required understanding attachment patterns just to feel stable. Holding on to that ideal can keep you emotionally stuck in a cycle of hope and disappointment. Because the more you try to make reality match that ideal through effort alone, the more exhausted you become.
There is a clear difference between understanding someone's attachment style and reshaping your entire personality to stay in a painful dynamic. One is awareness, the other is self-abandonment. Awareness can create healthier connection. Self-abandonment slowly destroys your emotional stability.
And this distinction is where many people lose themselves without even realizing it. If someone is truly working on themselves, going through self-reflection, therapy, or emotional growth, then understanding their attachment style can genuinely support the relationship. It can create patience, clarity, and better communication. But if you are the only one adjusting, the only one reading, learning, adapting, and emotionally managing the entire dynamic, then what you are in is not mutual growth. It is emotional waiting. In the end,
What this all comes down to is understanding patterns without losing yourself in them. Some people struggle with closeness, some struggle with distance, and in many relationships those differences create confusion instead of clarity. But awareness gives you the ability to see what is happening more clearly, so you are not constantly blaming yourself or forcing something that feels unstable.
Real connection cannot survive on effort from only one side. It grows when both people are willing to reflect, communicate, and take responsibility for their own emotional responses. And just as importantly, it grows when you stay connected to your own life, your own peace, and your own emotional balance. Because the strongest relationships are not built on chasing or withdrawing, but on two people meeting each other with honesty, steadiness, and mutual respect.